Hello again. My name's, as I said, Jude Philp. I'm Senior Curator for the Macleay Collections here at the Chau Chak Wing Museum. And for those of you who are alumni of the university, you probably know us better as the Macleay Museum over near the footbridge, the Nicholson Museum in the Quadrangle, and the Art Gallery in the War Memorial Archway. And then in 2020, we all combined into this one space. When we did that, we worked with communities over at Metro to ensure that we were creating a safe space in terms of cultural legacies of both the collections that we hold and the place that we live on. And with part of that was their generosity in sharing with us these words, Ningi Nalawangan, Mari Bujari, Gadinurada, which mean we meet on the very beautiful Gadigal country. Those words were put together by the Research DVC for Indigenous Heritage, Jackie Troy, who studied here at the university to make a linguistic whole of a fragment from Padagaran and William Dawes's conversations about language way back in 1790, 1800. And of course, with everything, those words have changed as Dharawal people continue to use language in any way that they can. And today we partner with the Gujaga Foundation out at La Perouse, or Kamei, who are working to teach from infant school up and to join with families at home learning of language in a new way. So it's a really exciting time for museums to both think about the legacies of our collections and think of how we can join up together with things today and people today. So I'm talking about Papua New Guinea. In terms of Aboriginal Australia, for 55,000 of those 65,000 years of continuous occupation, New Guinea, the island, was joined above sea level to Australia. And it is a really interesting thing to think about products like coconuts, which must have been just assiduously always removed from coastlines by Aboriginal people, but nourished and nurtured by Torres Strait Islanders, Papua New Guineans, as something that is really part of their culture, but which Aboriginal people said, no, this is not something for this land. It's an interesting way of thinking about a multinational Australia from 65,000 years ago. So I'll start with that kind of idea. This is in part the beginning of the Macleay's collection, which relate directly to Papua New Guinea and connect us as a museum with a number of people across the whole of what is now the nation of Papua New Guinea. And it is two rather sad-looking insects from Katau in the western province of Papua New Guinea, collected in 1875 by William John Macleay. He was, like many of the university's founders, someone who had gained immense wealth through land acquisitions from Aboriginal land, not purchases, but acquisitions through violence and settlement and other ways. And he used his wealth to build a collection that would be useful for the university's teaching and learning. It was specifically what he wanted to do. He had been a squatter at Dubbo. He moved to Sydney, where his family had been living since the 1820s. And he became one of the founders of the university, a member of Senate. He also married the Chancellor's daughter, Susan Thompson, Dees Thompson's daughter, and he inherited an enormous collection of insects, one of the oldest in the world today, and was one of the most important in the world in the 1820s, which his uncle had brought with him to Australia. And he determined then to make this collection, both the really old material, some of it dating to 1750s, insects from then, to connect that with what was the new learning and possibilities from an Australian view outwards. So he funded the first Australian overseas scientific expedition. It's called the Cheviot Expedition, and it was sent off from Sydney with huge fanfare, grand dinners and mentions in the press and hopes of prosperity. And he and a group of very bearded men went all the way up the coast across to Chau here, where he asked the leader of that settlement at Chau, a Kiwi man called Mainu, if he could help people collect for him. So the people of the village of Chau end up collecting a lot of material that's still in the collections today. And a really extraordinary step that Macleay took, because you very rarely see him mention anything to do with people or talking to people or an interest in people in his diaries or those that survive. But he named this insect after that same man. And that was a really remarkable thing to do as such a, straight-laced kind of colonial man who was trained and understood the taxonomic system, whereby you were only allowed under the Strickland Code of 1850 to use someone's name in a name for an animal if they had a consequence to the subject. So you couldn't call them after Padagaran just because you thought Padagaran should be honoured for her insect knowledge. It had to be connected. So he's saying here, this isn't just someone who helped us. This is someone who had a profound effect and influence on the history of our knowledge of animals across New Guinea. Anyway, he returned from Papua New Guinea, not to great fanfare. These are some of the other things that he collected, but really to a very cross settlement which said, why did you not open up the country for us? Why did you not find gold? Why were you crawling around the bushes looking for insects and shells? What on earth were you doing? He continued to remain staunch that he had done a very successful expedition. Tens of thousands of things were collected, predominantly animals, but also cultural objects like these, and could be used in further our understanding. So this was 1875. By 1882, the university accepted the whole of his collection, which he had expanded from entomology into all areas of zoology. So it would be interesting for students to research and learn from. And the university was on a very progressive move forward to include science within its curriculum. Up into the sort of 1870s, classics was, the reason for the Nicholson being here, was that education was bound in mathematics and classical arts from ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, Greek, these kinds of learnings that were the foundation of European knowledge systems, or as perceived to be. So it was a really, really modern step for the university to not just take on science as a new discipline, but also to include this kind of collection as useful for teaching and learning. The government architecture built the building, the university housed the collection, and Macleay paid for a curator, George Masters. These are some of the other things that he collected. This is from Kiwi and is part of today a global research done by Melbourne University academic Ian McNiven, working with Torres Strait Islanders and people of Kiwi, where Chau is, to understand more about these sorts of objects that came in. So to know what Chau looks like, it's somewhere around, where's this red thing gone? Somewhere here on this coast. This is Kiwi Island, where the people moved in the sort of 16th century and moved down this coastline to here. And this Fly River is one of the 4 largest rivers in the world. It has its own weather system. It affects El Nino and La Nina patterns. It's enormous. And the silt from this is what the islands of Saibai, Boigu and Kurama are made from. Torres Strait Islanders come from those mudflats. And so, so understanding where those people get enormous stone objects like this from was then part of a really fervent interest of people moving, moving from these sorts of objects and thinking and traveling back to New Guinea to try and understand, well, how do you get that huge thing? How do you mill it? How do you make it into this beautiful adze, and down from the highlands. So for those of you who aren't very well taught about Papua New Guinea and Australia's history, this is a map that isn't just from the Geosciences Department here at the University of Sydney, it's also the work that they did throughout the late 19th, early 20th century that led to this knowledge being here. So in 1885, Australia, New South Wales and Victoria convinced Britain to make a colony of this part of New Guinea. It was sort of all that was left to them because this was owned by the Dutch and this was owned by the Germans. And so this part became British New Guinea. And in 1901, with Federation, Australia became more involved in the active colonisation of that same space. It became Australian administered New Papua. And after the First World War, through the League of Nations, Australia was gifted the responsibility for the whole of German and British New Guinea as Australian administered Papua and New Guinea. It became independent in 1976. So between, so if we go back, sorry. No, I've gone forward. We've got a whole, so once people started to think about and explore these regions, and this is a map from the first long-term colonial officer, William McGregor. It is again one of 13 large maps that charts the whole of this region by foot. So he is using, oh, now I've lost them, instruments like these in order to get heights, to measure mountains, to work out geography, productivity, to map where gardens are, where prosperity is. They're looking for things that might be able to assist Papua New Guineans of the future to be able to run their own economy. So what woods are really viable, what plantations work in this area, those sorts of questions. So I'm hopping around the place. I'm going to return to John Macleay, but also what we do today with some of this legacy material, some of these tens of thousands of things that he got back from New Guinea in 1875. So this is a Torres Strait pigeon or an imperial pigeon. There's one in the gallery downstairs on level 1 at the moment. And as you can see across, this is how we would register it in line with the taxonomic system of biological sciences. This is the way that internationally everybody recognises this same bird. But today we are looking to see how can we make these more discoverable to other people, to people who might need to know, is the nesting site of this bird, which moves from the north coast of Arnhem Land through the Torres Strait, New Guinea, and all the way over to the far islands of the Trobriands. How do we make these noticeable to others so that if they were trying to make a claim about an issue for nesting sites for the bird, they can locate the information and the ranges of that bird of a similar from the 1870s to show this is something that was part of our culture and has now no longer able to be here because of whatever was the particular incident that happened. So we're trying to change languages to also teach this to some of the people in humanities. We have a course that is about trying to think of what's cultural about these. How can we move these kinds of collections from not just being used by biological scientists and environmental scientists in various ways to also be used to understand history, like the history of the Cheviot expedition, for instance, or to understand the meanings and purposes of this bird. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Torres Strait Islander flag. It's got the green, the black and the blue, and in the middle is this circle of white. That's a headdress, and that's the bird that provides the feathers for that headdress. So these kinds of cultural, that's where it comes from, is one of those cultural aspects of biological sciences that we're trying to get students to think, why do museums have these dead things? I mean, if you want to see a traditional kind of museum display of dead things, go down to the Natural Selections exhibition. Because it's weird that we have all these little statues of animals sitting there for people to look at. They're amazing, they're interesting. Don't get to see a pangolin except in museums if you live in Australia, but it is something that we're trying to encourage students to think more about. How can they be useful in the world? How can we use these kinds of animals to talk about poetry and poetics in some of these countries where you might have a poem written about the passage of birds like this and relationships to world systems. So this is one of two connections of the Antarctic, which the university is again very famous for its exploration of the Antarctic on the Mawson and subsequent expeditions through Griffith Taylor and others, again over in geography and geology. And this man is, on the old banknote, is Lawrence Hargrave, and he's there because he invented this thing called a box kite. It was used to test weather systems in the Antarctic on Mawson's voyage. And he also invented a variety of pre-flight machines. So at the same time as the Wright brothers are thinking about how to get flight. We have one of these. This is actually the one in the powerhouse, but we have one of these because it went with Griffith Taylor to test weather systems when he went on the expedition. And I say it's one of two connections to Papua New Guinea because Lawrence Hargraves was Macleay's engineer on the Cheviot. He was the reason why the Cheviot was given a bad welcome back home, because he thought that these bearded men were too conservative, wouldn't allow him off the boat to go and explore and do whatever he liked, kept on just doing collecting of animals like they said they would. It was very boring. So he then had a number of conversations with people about its inability to see a future. But he returned and became a very successful engineer. And his diary of that same Cheviot is now in the powerhouse. The other connection to Papua New Guinea that we have is in the photographic collections, because it was on the worst of the Antarctic explorations where they got stuck that Frank Hurley, the famous Australian photographer whose work you can currently see in the State Library's new photographic exhibition, where Frank Hurley also got stuck, was made to break a lot of his negatives. And when they were waiting for rescue, he and two others determined that if they ever got out of it alive, they would go to the most beautiful tropical place they could ever think of and explore there instead. And he was the only one who made it out alive, because following not just the Antarctic rescue was World War I, and then by the 1920s, he mounted his own expedition with the Australian Museum to the Gulf province of Papua New Guinea, to Kerema. So we have, because of that expedition and because of the teaching of the importance of Papua New Guinea throughout the university, we have Frank Hurley's images, not because of Frank Hurley, but because they were copied for teaching in anthropology, they were copied for teaching in geography, they were copied for teaching in all different manners of disciplines, and those collections have come to the museum for us to now teach with. So this map is, it's a use map, if you like. It tells you what the geology is and some of the food growing areas and other sorts of things. It's one of those really important maps. But it's the kind of map that once you get to this period, and Chinnery is here in 1915, the university is deeply involved in teaching administrative officers to go to Papua New Guinea. So in particularly following the Second World War, but also from 1910, hundreds and then thousands of Australians served as overseas officers of ASOPA, the Australian Pacific Administrative Organisation, something of that nature, which was at Middlehead in Sydney, over in Mossman. They taught thousands of young men, principally, but also women, to go into Papua New Guinea and become administrators. So they would do anything from patrol officers going and checking that villages are okay, that there haven't been arguments or fights or disease breakouts or any of those sorts of things. They also were responsible for sort of trying to keep running the schools and to administer some of those works. And to give you a sense of how difficult that was, it took Europeans from 1606, when they first sighted Papua New Guinea, to 1935 to reach the highlands of Papua New Guinea. That wasn't true of people of Papua New Guinea who have roads right into the highlands for millennia, proved through things like shell necklaces that are worn up in the highlands that come from the Torres Strait and other coastal regions. So that's how difficult this place is to navigate and to move around in. And it is famously one of the most linguistically diverse areas in the entire world, partly because of that. So that's another thing the ASOPA workers were being taught. They taught anthropology, including linguistics, and how to take down new languages, how to make written languages from things that you hear. They were being taught geography to be able to make maps, and they were being taught very basic health skills to also be able to administer health regions. That changed in 1975. This is just a reminder of some of the other interests that many people, or family heritage that also connects many people today with Papua New Guinea through the Second World War. This is Alatau Bay and is the site of a number of sinkings. So there's continuous archaeological and also government interest in getting old planes out of that deep water. I lost my thread. So anyway, I think I'm about up. My 15 minutes is up. So I will quickly just move on to, again, sort of look at these collections. Hold all of this stone material in part because of those geologists who are going through and seeing what kinds of mineral wealth is found in Papua New Guinea. And these are also stones that are of great interest and purposefulness for cultural reasons and connect people between a knowledge of geology, an intimate knowledge of geology, mining, and use of rocks between our own cultures and theirs. From independence, we started to get to learn more about people's own perceptions and stories of their history. And this is one from that same area that Macleay started in, about shooting a cassowary, and you'll see this man's wearing a dari, which is a connection between them and the Torres Strait Islanders gone for millennia. This is one of a number of these images, and that is a Torres Strait pigeon. And then today, as I said, we're trying to work together more to link these collections together, both in university teaching, but also working with people. This is a man called Dairi Arua, who's an expert maker in Motu around Port Moresby in New Guinea. And when he was here, he didn't just look at and teach us about objects in the collection, but he was also very interested and gave us a lot of information about a lot of the animals that we have that come from his area, which are used for all kinds of things. Yes, that's me. Sorry. Thank you.